Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at TEFAF and in this very beautiful room at the Park Avenue Armory. I'd like to follow in Simone's footsteps and very much thank the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art for bringing together our talented panelists for today. The ICAA, if you don't know it, is an educational nonprofit that supports courses, lectures, documentary films, and more focused on classical and traditional architecture, design, and craft. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. We're going to start at the far end, Rodrigo Boyat Montenegro. He's the principal of RBM Architecture and Design, a firm dedicated to custom design and community urban planning. Next to him is Elizabeth Graziolo, the award-winning founder, principal of Yellow House Architects, a Manhattan firm, a collaborative-minded practice specializing in residential and commercial work. Next to her is Stephen Spandl of Stephen W. Spandl Architect, a Manhattan firm with a focus on new residential and restoration projects. And next to me is Tham Kanilikam, principal of Tham Kanilikam Designs, a New York-based interior design firm specializing in residential spaces. Over the last few weeks, we've all had really fun breakfasts and very lively Zoom conversations, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but they have been very lively and lots of fun. And one thing we wanted to make very clear is we're not here in any way, shape, or form to dismiss modern architecture or contemporary architecture, because so many of the founding fathers and mothers of modern architecture had classical groundings. So they were able to take that forward into their own work, even if you were not able to necessarily recognize it straight away. We also didn't want you to think that we were going to talk about temples or houses with columns and pediments. I think Stephen Spandl was the one who wanted to point that one out early on.
Sometimes they have columns and
Sometimes they do have columns and pediments. But one thing we wanted to talk about straight away is, so you would get more of an understanding of our panelists, how did you get into this profession? And in particular, how did you become interested in classicism as a driving force in your work? Liz.
Oh my gosh, I'm the winner. In terms of the profession in general, I think architecture is something I fell into. I was very young when I applied for university, and not knowing really what I wanted to do. I kind of fell up. Cooper Union accepted my application. I don't know how. I have not seen my test. I'll be very happy to see what I did. After that first semester at Cooper, I was like really hooked into architecture. And again, in terms of like falling into something, after Cooper Union, I worked for a small firm called Cicognani Cala Architect for a couple of years, and then eventually went to Peter Pernod Architects, where I was there for almost like 17 years. And I was a partner there, and this is where I learned about traditional architecture. It's something I feel like I was aware of. It was always part of my life growing up in Europe. I'm Haitian by birth and grew up in Europe. But you don't really know it. And this is something I'm gonna preface by saying that architecture, it's about like the way you feel. It's because it's all about proportion and balance. And I felt like coming out of Cooper and actually having a better understanding of it at Peters really kind of like set the way for me for my practice, and eventually I'm here. I'm done. I don't want to take the whole hour.
All right. Stephen.
So I grew up in South Georgia on a farm, about 45 minutes inland from Savannah in a very small town. But anytime I needed to go to the pediatrician or the doctor, anything, we always went to Savannah. And Savannah has a wonderful historic district with incredible early historic homes, and I was lucky enough to have parents that would take me to those houses and to visit those house museums over and over. We did the same thing by going to Jekyll Island, where there's the historic district there with cottages by the likes of David Adler and John Russell Pope, and we did that on a yearly basis as well. So I somehow absorbed those things, and that's what I always gravitated toward from a very young age. And ended up going to Georgia Tech in Atlanta for undergraduate, where they teach contemporary modern architecture and kind of tell you, classicism is not a great thing, it's backward looking, you don't really want to do that. Was lucky enough to have a great architecture history professor who guided me in the path that I'm on now, pointed me in the direction of Notre Dame for graduate school, and that's how I ended up doing this.
Pam?
I started as a young age just loving, being surrounded and wanting to be, surrounded by beauty. And so as a child of immigrants, we had to leave our home country and started over in America. And so we really came with nothing. And so I've always wanted to surround myself with beautiful homes and beautiful objects. And it's something like Liz said that you can't really explain why you gravitate towards this field is because it's not something that you can create or read in a textbook and understand in a textbook. It's just a feeling that you want to be, a part of. Mm-hmm. And so for me, coming from and leaving everything behind, it was my way of acquiring something of history and a story, and to tell a story within, a little bit of the backdrop of Laos, but now my story is, how I was raised in America and having this opportunity and creating opportunity here, so.
Rodrigo?
So I was born and raised in Guatemala City, and I was part of this large family who just valued tradition immensely. And not just valuing tradition for the sake of tradition, but really, I was always taught to understand where our heritage comes from, why we do certain things, why our grandparents had certain traditions and how they passed them over to us. So to me, the language of tradition was actually very natural. And very much like Stephen, going into my undergraduate education, which was a modern contemporary, fantastic school, but the answers when it came to design, it just didn't quite satisfy me. And sometimes they even seemed slightly arbitrary, and it just didn't really quite rhyme with my upbringing in understanding that language of tradition. And so on my first job, I worked for a traditional firm called Estudio Urbano, and I remember asking my boss, what about this room? Why is it this shape? And he went out of his way to explain to me why, thousands of years ago, there was this room, and how he brought back books and showed me and how different architects have done it during the past, and how now we can do it in a new way, but also based in something that is true and historical. And that to me clicked, because that spoke my language of tradition. And I started pursuing traditional architecture right around that time.
I know one of the things that we've talked about a lot over the last few weeks in preparing for this is the idea that there's a difference between classicism as a style and classicism as a vocabulary. And I was wondering if we could just sort of talk the way we did over breakfast earlier this week, because it really does sort of twist your head in a different way when you think that it's about proportions and how did those pleasing proportions come about, because it's not columns, it's proportions, and that can be seen in modern architecture, in arts and crafts, in this building.
Yes.
Can we talk a bit about that as something you've learned or understood or are working on in your own practices?
Of course, we had a lot of conversations even earlier this week about how classicism is a language that has a lot of different dialects. There are regional vernaculars, so classicism is inherently very adaptable. You're working within the overarching premise of proportion and craftsmanship, ornamentation, but it really is incredibly adaptable to different places and different times. If we look at classicism over the years, it's been used in many different ways by different architects, by different firms, and by us in our generation.
Also a different country. I think if you think
Yes.
of it as a language, right? There's the basic principles, which has proven to be, they work over and over again. To me, it's like, it's not any difference from like, a chef. I'm sorry, but because I love food as well. When you go to a cooking school, you learn the basic of like French cooking. It's like, okay, you take the principles of like cooking and then you kind of like twist it and put your own interpretation. But then at the end of the day, it's like what comes out. So it's like about proportion, balance, and clarity. If you're designing, you design like a really well, like clear plan that has clarity. So some of our clients, they don't even know what is the difference, but they know it feels good. It's very clear to them, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's about like the principle of it as well, like the system, like it's proven over and over again that it works. That's what classicism is for me, and then how I apply it into my practice.
I think that what Liz says about there's something true to it, certain principles that have worked over and over again. Part of the reason for that is because classicism is based on the art of construction. And so a beam will always be a beam. You can decorate it, you can make it as elaborate as possible or as simple as possible, but the principle of the structure always remains the same. And what classicism does is that it celebrates that structural joint, that structural pier, and makes it into an art form that is communicating decorum, that is communicating the character of the owner of the building. And so classicism takes construction and puts it beyond to a more artful way, I think. It's more inspiring, I think. And that's why I like to use it in my practice too, because it's just using true principles and applying art.
And we set up a palette for Tam.
Yes.
And do her beauty.
So in order to have balance and harmony, it's really important to have good scale and proportion in order for me to give a good design. Is because yes, there's so much we can do with like faux finishes and decorating, but if a room has beautiful scale and proportion, then it's quite easy for me to tell the story in this space for the client.
The other thing that I love about classicism, where a lot of people, once you hear the term, as we've discussed, classicism or traditionalism, and there's a large group of people whose eyes glaze over, as it not being very exciting, it being rote. But if you look back historically, how often classicism as a vocabulary, as a style, has been reinvented over and over and over again. I mean, it's almost not even worth. I remember once Peter Penoyer saying to me, I think I said neoclassicism, and he said, "There's no such thing as neoclassicism. It's just classicism. It just keeps going and going and going." I mean, when you look at it, how it was done in the 18th century, or even stretching it all the way back to Petra and Rome, and then you keep moving forward, and you see it. Then you see suddenly the 1930s, and it's all, you start seeing Ionic columns made of mirror, which is insane. And then you see it being redone in the Pomo period. I mean, it just seems like it's just this constantly elastic language, almost like the English language. It can absorb almost anything.
I mean, it's funny you said the word Petra. I was there, I was in Jordan last summer. And then on my way to visit Petra, I went into one of like the old sites, like historic site in archaeological stuff. Okay. People, it's Friday. I mean, Saturday. I don't know. I'm so freaking tired. I like a whole week. I keep. Anyway, my point was, so I went to visit one of those sites, and then saw some of the most amazing mosaic work that was done, like before AD, some years before AD, and taking pictures, talking about like classical like architecture or just like materials or like finishes and palette, and I took a picture, and then that was my inspiration for a modern day project I was working on. I just fell in love with it, and I kind of like put a modern twist to it, but that was like the basic of my inspiration for an apartment that I was working on for a client now, and everybody loved it. It was like it's just amazing how that works, because if you have like something that is well designed and balanced, it doesn't matter what year it was done, but it's still relevant to today.
Right.
Yeah.
For example, it's, Greek key motif.
Right.
It's been thousands of years that have been used in textile, in archaeology site, in you name it. We're still using that motif here today, but it's changed in design, it's changed in scale and proportion. So we're just adapting it, or we're simplifying things. So we're still using that vein through generations of designs and architecture.
Right, it's sort of like how you see like a capital of a column that is has a very classical look at one point in time, but then Latrobe did it as corn cobs, and then Louis Comfort Tiffany, creator of this room, did his column capitals in giant flowers. I mean, it's just this constant reinvention of some very, very basic forms, which is pretty fascinating to me that it seems unlike modernism. It just keeps going forward over and over and over again.
Right.
It's just constantly reinvented.
One thing my very first boss in Atlanta, Norman Askins, told me when I was leaving his office to go to graduate school at Notre Dame, go learn the rules, but always trust your eye. And that's really, I think, how classicism develops over time. We as a group have even traveled together many times. We're close friends up here, which is nice. But we're constantly going and seeing things, looking at photos, referencing books, traveling as much as possible, going to different countries, different regions. And we're constantly, as Liz said, seeing something that catches our eye and then learning about that. And generally that makes its way into a project, sometimes at the sort of coaxing of a client who has a particular interest or a particular collection that's going in their space. And often just because it's something that caught our eye in daily life. But that's one of the things that makes the field so fun and interesting. We're always, we're sort of chasing something, learning as much as we can about it, and then we see something else, and then we chase that and learn as much as we can about it.
That is the beauty of it, right? It's like there are the set of rules or principles, but it's like, what do you do with it? I mean, you can be a very dedicated student and repeat classical architecture and style to a T. But I think for me, what makes it interesting is what do you do with that? You can create something new, and this is where the modern aspect of it come into play. It's like, how do I interpret this and make it relevant, but still paying homage to the classical architecture, the classical style in general.
How do you do that? You just mentioned earlier a project that you were working on. How do you contemporize a classical inspiration like the one that you discussed?
Well, one example, for anybody who hasn't seen Gibbs Bay, New York, no, just kidding. I'm plugging my own self. We just finished a project where, it was kind of like a restoration project. We walked in, it was a very, very much traditionally designed space, and we were asked to make it, we had to do something with it. And at first I walked in it. This is the entrance hall at Gibbs Bay, and I was like, okay, so how do I make this feel contemporary? I really wanted to respect the house itself because it had a lot of history. I didn't want to start ripping things out. So one of the way I kind of pay homage to the space was kind of embellish it with modern materials. For example, a few months ago, I met this really great artisan, talking about artisan and how people practice different trades. I think it's so important. And they were creating something new with glass, and I thought it was so interesting. I was like, oh, why don't I just use that and kind of embellish the existing architecture that was there? And somehow the two of them married very well and was very well received. And I think it's just getting out of the norm and try to be creative with what's given to you, but respecting the original design.
Because it's a very classical entrance hall with paneling.
Yeah.
And Liz infilled the paneling with these sort of sheets of dark glass that if you look at it the right way, it's almost like water is
Yeah.
pouring inside of the panels.
Correct.
But you've got it within this classical framework.
Correct, but it was such a modern technique or modern way of treating glass work. Somehow the two of them with like the panel, they just worked. And I think for me, that's really what's interesting about like the work itself. Yeah.
Now, Rodrigo, you had mentioned at one point in our discussions the idea of classicism on a public scale,
Yes.
on a street level. And I'd love to explore that a bit for the audience, because I know it made me think in a different way about our forthcoming discussions.
Sure. I think we often think of classicism as temples, columns, or maybe interiors that are highly decorative, but we don't always notice that it actually extends out into the public realm. So for example, one of my favorite things about coming to New York is going to, walking by buildings like this one, because this is such a massive building, but if you look at it from the outside, the moldings, the materials, it brings everything down to the human scale, and it makes the street, and therefore the street experience, a lot more dignified. If we think about cities as the backdrop to our daily lives, we conduct businesses, we have friendships, and we meet up with people, but always in the backdrop, there are buildings. What kind of buildings do we want those to be? And so classicism is a great language for the exterior because it creates just very dignified buildings for the city, a proper backdrop for our daily lives. Certainly one that I would love to be in.
I just came across a quote of, I think it was Stephen, saying this. No, it was very funny. We sat there, we were all laughing maniacally over it at breakfast. And that was, it's easier to have a competent building as a classicist.
Rodrigo. That was Rodrigo.
That's Rodrigo. Okay, good. That's on you. It's easier to build a competent building as a classicist because it's a good system. And it's hard to have a bad classical building, but it's easy to create a bad contemporary building because there are no rules. And I really liked that because
extremely
it really gave a real explanation of what we're talking about with this hanging things within this system.
Right. I like to use the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants because that system has been tested and proven, as Liz said, over millennia. And so there have been architects before us that have, created these wonderful precedents for us to use. And so whether it be renovating an existing room that is classical, the fact that you have a good room is a great place to start, as opposed to having a completely blank slate and then doing whatever you want. I think having somebody to look to will automatically give you a leg up in designing something that is competent.
I mean, this is why even vernacular versions of very sort of high-tone classical architecture always seem to work. A column is a column is a column,
Yeah.
whether it's in Hungary or it's in Iowa. But it's how it was interpreted by a builder or a carpenter or
Right.
something. So it as a language, it's something that's easily you can to wrap your arms around, as opposed to trying to do a modern building in a vernacular style, which I don't think exists. But it's possible that it does.
Yeah.
But I really like that this idea of the reinvention when we were talking about one of the delights about driving around, certainly New York State, is seeing the vernacular takes on Greek revival, on American colonial, depending on what part of the state it's in, who's come up with it, what they were thinking of. You get the idea of, were they looking at a pattern book, or did someone just describe a building that they'd seen and just said, go for it? There's a lot of go for it that classicism really allows.
Right. It's true, and it's interesting to note. I was having this conversation with someone in the past few days. In the past, there were sort of master craftspeople, I guess you could say. There were contractors, essentially, who you could hire they would kind of design your house. It was full service. They would design it, they would construct it. They were referencing pattern books. That's something that's kind of been lost in current day society, which is a shame. We're lucky because we get to still work with master craftspeople on a regular basis. I know a lot of the projects that I've worked on with them, some of the people we work with are in the room today. And we're incredibly lucky to have these incredible artisans working on our buildings, doing plaster work, textiles, masonry.
Master carvers, that have learned the craft from their father, their great-grandfather.
Yes.
That is a challenge, though, I think, in terms of like, I know, Mitch, sorry, I'm taking over, talking about like, how do we apply this into like modern work, for example. I think one of the biggest challenges, if you think of like creating a piece that is contemporary, but has like this traditional feel, is finding this craftsmanship. For example, like straw marquetry, for example, like this is a system that's been used like during the 17th and 18th century to make beautiful furniture architecture. We did a project about, I think 4 years ago, where we wanted to make a whole library. It's very contemporary, but based out of like straw marquetry. And it was like challenging, right? To find like the right people to execute it properly. And I feel like this is one of the things we really need to kind of like focus on in terms of like supporting that craft.
Yes.
And then make sure those people are around.
Right, because that's an important part of classicism.
It is.
Correct.
Are the people who are holding it all up.
Correct.
Yeah.
And if we don't support them, where is classicism for the future of classicism, meaning our topic today? Where does it go
Exactly.
without bringing all of those crafts and people and talents along with you? And not only ensuring that they stay as authentic as possible, but giving them a reason to do something more exciting, more modern, to stretch what they do.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that brings us a bit to sustainability. We
Yes.
were talking about that a lot, about classical architecture and about the sustainability of materials.
Correct.
I mean, we're talking about a field that has a relatively narrow group of noble materials that just you're constantly reinventing, constantly recycling, constantly recreating. But that's a huge part of it, along with the artisanship, are these materials that are natural, that are sustainable, that are noble.
I think that because classical architecture came from the early art of construction, and it's based on, some of the proportions are based on construction on wood, for example, we tend to want to use natural materials just automatically, and I think using natural materials to begin with is the first step towards sustainability. We spoke about just how classicism exists in every culture, and where I'm from in Guatemala, classicism was built with the materials that were there. They were local, and that's the way that it existed all the time, using local stone, local quarries, local wood, and so that's what actually made the architecture of Guatemala feel Guatemalan, because it was all local. Step one towards sustainability, I think. I'll let somebody else go with step two.
Agreed. I think that's a large part of it. Also, the design in itself is inherently sustainable. The buildings are designed, the vernacular architecture responds to the region that it's in. So in the South where I grew up, there are deep porches surrounding homes, and it's because there was no air conditioning, there was no electricity. Things are designed for cross ventilation. So in a power outage, you could still survive in these houses. We were talking the other day about how a lot of the new sustainable buildings that are being designed are just glass boxes. If there was a power outage, you would cook in them. So really, it's a very interesting thing to discuss, and it's a great argument for why to use classicism, why to use that as the basis for design.
And on a design point of view, is buying antiques.
Yes.
Is very green.
Right.
So antiques hold, like brown furniture. They would have used old growth material, which would have been a lot stronger. And then if we keep promoting that we buy antiques, then we're not going to create from people wanting things that are reproduced, wanting things that are, quick ship and things like that. And so there's longevity in antiques. It's the process, it's the way that it's made, has quality, and so it lasts forever. And so these are the things that, people need to realize is antiques are, green.
Well, there's also something very beautiful about the scale of the antiques that you work with that's very much an echo of the architecture that they complement.
Which bring you into restoration work also, which is also considered green. You have like some of the old buildings in New York where you restore them. You find local stone to kind of like patch in the work that is needed. I think that's very sustainable. I think.
There's also something there very intimate about the materials that are used in a classical context. Most people understand what stone is, what wood is, whatever, but we're not necessarily intimate on a daily basis with steel, and it doesn't feed you in the same way. You don't touch a stone building in the same way that you touch a glass building. There's a whole different physical relationship that you have. I remember when I moved to New York a million years ago, and I decided to wander through the city to see as many Stanford White buildings as I could. And all I remember is touching stone and really feeling like the grit under your fingers. And it's not, there's nothing sexy about a steel and a glass building for me, in general. But the idea that it's not only is it a universal language, it's a universal material language.
Right.
It's romantic.
Yeah.
These materials are very romantic, like you're talking about natural stone. There's movement that we can't change. Wood, it's natural. And then there's a story behind the people who are manufacturing it. There's movement that you can't get with a poured porcelain or things like that. It's people, making sure that marble is used and they're sanding it down and things like that and adding finishes that are by hand. And so I think, for us, these natural materials are very romantic. And they even tell the story of the people who are doing it, processing things like that.
The artisans who carve that stone.
That's correct.
Who play in the wood. Also that idea that a classical building in many ways doesn't have to spend an enormous amount of time explaining itself.
Right.
It's like often, a modern building, and sometimes, you have to have it explained to you why it's a certain way, why the facade is torquing, why it's doing this, why it's doing that. Whereas a building often built on classical principles, even a modern building built on classical principles, there's something about it that speaks to you in a silent language of understanding. You sort of get it.
Even finding the front door.
Yeah.
Even finding the front door, this is true.
But it's so interesting because I feel like it's such a universal language. It doesn't matter, if it's an architect from Japan designing the second pavilion, or you go to an architect in Morocco designing a Riyadh. If they are designing based on the principle of traditional architecture, us as human beings, we go into the space and it just feels good. You may not understand why it's so beautiful, it feels so nice. It's because in the background, that is the basic of the language they were designing from.
Right. That thing of how we live in these buildings too. The idea that that famous Winston Churchill quote that we shape our buildings and then they shape us.
Right.
I remember that being really strongly felt to me when I was in the Netherlands and I was visiting a Rietveld building, one of his earliest houses, and it's presented in this sort of machine effect. And then I'm sitting here, the one person on the tour, on my iPhone, looking for period photographs of this house, and realizing that the owner of the house, who was then having an affair with Rietveld, she had the house full of potted plants and textiles and children and dogs and plates. And I thought, how are we supposed to understand this building if she didn't live in it in a modern way? She lived in it in a regular, normal, domestic fashion. And in a way that a classical building invites you to do and doesn't reject.
Correct.
Right.
That was another thing that we talked about in some of our earlier discussions, that a lot of, there seems to be the idea that a classical interior is somewhat stuffy, maybe a little bit uptight. But in reality, the things that we do are incredibly relaxed interiors.
And livable.
Exactly, right. Where you can come in, you can sit your stack of books on the table or under the table or wherever, or things don't look out of place. It blends in.
Well, and things wear well.
Yes.
For some classical buildings, wear well.
Right.
Whether, scratches, dogs, whatever. For some reason,
it's
they wear
patina.
well. But modern buildings, you have to have built into your budget
Right.
the maintenance issue, which because they only look good when they're perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's going back to what Tham was saying about materials a moment ago. These materials that we work with on a daily basis, that we're lucky to work with, patina over time. They age beautifully, and they last. So just like you said, you don't have to clean them constantly.
Interesting is to walk around TAFE, because although this particular iteration of TAFE has a very contemporary, modern feeling, you keep stumbling over, or at least I did, keep stumbling over contemporary artists who are taking something classical or historical and reinventing it. There's a beautiful Kehinde Wiley portrait that's sort of within this Gothic tabernacle frame.
Right. An altarpiece.
That suddenly makes you, it has this really great jarring moment, or that there's a beautiful blue and white porcelain. From a distance, it looks like a Chinese porcelain plate, a bowl. And you got closer and closer, and it's Ai Weiwei's take on a traditional Chinese bowl, but it's the same technique, it's the same glazing, it's just a different imagery. And I think that those sort of things throughout TAFE speak to what we're discussing about the constant mutability of classicism and that lasting language.
I don't know which atelier also represented a Geoponti table. It's a
Right.
classic round table. But like, take your typical round table, and then Geoponti does his magic, and then you have like this gorgeous reinterpretation of what that should look like.
And he's an architect. He's
And he's
modern
an architect
who
also,
had
yeah.
a very strong classical upbringing. I mean, education. I mean, some of the buildings of his that delight me most are those really early sort of nutty takes on Palladian architecture, like 1910, 1917. And you're like, wait, that's Ponti? So when you look at his modern work, you feel that there is that underpinning of a classical language that he is now making the foundation for his modern takes. Again, with the scale, the proportion, the way you feel in the room. They're modern rooms, but they feel right.
Correct.
That goes back to something that we had also discussed during our meetings before, pointing out that the early modernists that we all grew up wanting to be like Mies van der Rohe, they were trained as classicists. And so they had that system almost within their design style. And I believe classicism is a disciplining way for you to design, and I can see it in all of the early modernism, because it really there's a reason why the early modernism is considered probably like the greatest one, because it was the most disciplined one, and I think it comes from the fact that the early architects were embracing classicism at first, but then willingly said, all right, we're going to set these rules apart. But they knew the rules, they knew those proportions, and they decided to do
And they
something
couldn't
else.
discard those rules.
Right.
I mean, you might be able to set them aside, but everything you're designing, everything you're building, those early modernists, it's in their head the whole time. It's not like you can just completely erase it from your memory.
It becomes your foundation.
Exactly.
Oh.
Your guide.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed TAFE.